Appreciate you being here on a Saturday morning. Yeah, so my goal today is hopefully just to talk at you as like least amount as possible and get out and move and squat and problem solve and kind of hear what issues you guys are having, and then also hopefully learn from some of you guys as well. Kind of the presentation goals, so we'll run through some relevant anatomy and mobility requirements for the squat, and we'll focus more on front squat today, just as that applies to the Olympic lifting and CrossFit and some of you that do just purely Olympic lifting. We'll talk some ways to kind of work around squatting with pain, because I know a lot of your athletes and maybe some of you have pain when you squat, and just to give you some really simple kind of decision making ways to modify and mitigate some of that. We'll talk about some myths around squatting that may or may not be true or may partially be true, and kind of give you my 2 cents on that. We'll look at some kind of weak links or sticking points that we have in the squat and some ways to specifically address it, and then really get into more of kind of like lab demonstration work on some drills. And at that point, I'd love to like hear questions, hear ideas, drills you use, specific things we could take a look at and make this as relevant as we can. And to finish up, I'll talk about a quick case study with an athlete that I've worked with, and maybe even make Cannon get on the table to talk about some stuff we've been working on. Perfect. Put him on the spot, but kind of give you a background on how, as a physical therapist, I'd look at some limitations or kind of optimizing strengths of anybody. So a quick introduction for me. My name's Ryan Peterson. I grew up in southern Idaho, and then I moved to Salt Lake to go to the U in 2010, and I went to University of Montana for PT school. I've kind of bounced around the last 4 years. I worked in Idaho for a year. I was down here in Holiday for a year. I was up in Sun Valley, Idaho for a year, and I've been back in Salt Lake with Craft since May. And then I've also, since August, started working with the US ski team. I actually just got back from Finland and Norway to their start of their World Cup season, so that's been cool. Low back, if you let the knee go forward, we have about a 20% increase in knee load. If you restrict the knee and make the hips go back, it's almost 1,000% increase in load at the hip and the low back. Now that number's been used to like scare people because that's a big number and it sounds scary, but we don't really know like what is too much load at the back. It's so individual per person on their history. So that should be taken with a grain of salt as well. Just understand that when we restrict it somewhere, it goes somewhere else. And I think I'd rather take a 20% increase at my knees than a 900 to 1,000 on my back and hips. So again, some ideas on if you have knee pain, yeah, let's shift it to the hips. If you have back pain, let's shift it to the knees. If you have back and knee pain, just go home. Nothing we can do for you. Any questions on the myths or the anatomy stuff we ran through? And I don't know about you guys, this is kind of how I feel when I'm trying to attain that perfect front squat. Just always kind of out of reach. So first, kind of starting from the ground, working up. Ankle dorsiflexion is huge. Knee flexion, hip rotation, spinal extension and rotation, shoulder external rotation, I think is something we miss a lot with the front squat. And what I've seen has kind of the biggest bang for your buck for people with issues in the front rack and even progressing to like an overhead or a snatch position. And lat length kind of ties into that. I'm not going to talk a ton about chasing mobility just for the sake of chasing mobility, because there's always context around it. We see all these drills on Instagram and the internet of 3 drills to optimize your hip mobility, and it's just assuming that everyone's hip is the same. And there's some things that I would tell people not to push through just to look like that shape or position that somebody got in on Instagram. So we'll talk about a couple, and I have an infographic that we'll send out to all the coaches and the athletes of kind of a checklist that you can do on your own. Really simple ways, just kind of a growth screen of, oh, am I really limited here? But then there's certain things, like anatomically, that might limit us at like a bone level, that no amount of stretching is gonna help. It can honestly make things worse if we're trying to push through like fixed structures and to the detriment of some of our soft tissue or cartilage. So everybody has a different hip socket shape. Not only the angle that it sits, front to back, also up and down. The depth of the socket is different for everybody. Our femur, the femoral head and femoral neck have different lengths, different angles, different rotations of the shaft of the femur, and all of these things are gonna come into play to end up in a little different shape in our squat. Something I really struggle with is my femur length to torso length. So it's tough for me to keep an upright torso in a front squat or even a back squat, just because I have to get into a deep hip flex position because of the length of my femur. And there's ways to work around that, right? We can improve, widen the stance, increase rotation to functionally shorten that femur, but we're not gonna change bone lengths, so we need to kind of understand that and work around it. No perfect squat pattern, right? If you're an Olympic lifter, one, you're gonna have the physical proportions. It's gonna kind of select yourself out to get to that level. LeBron James on the far right will never do that front squat, no matter how hard he tries, but he doesn't need to, right? He needs like a minimum effective dose of strength training to keep his body healthy. And so that kind of goofy butt out squat, like he's doing pretty well. So I'm not gonna change LeBron's squat. And then in the middle of a power lifter going super wide. Again, that squat's not gonna translate to Olympic lifting very well. And you need a lot of adductor length, a lot of adductor strength. He's using a squat suit, that changes the mechanics of a squat as well. So context matters. I'm gonna say that over and over again. That we don't have to have a perfect squat, let's find the perfect squat for you. So real quick, we'll touch on squatting with pain. Yeah, sometimes the secret is you're always in pain and then just deal with it. So I think Brad's done a great job, and I want to try to continue that, is we don't want people to completely stop what they're doing in the gym just because they've had injury or had pain. We're going to help them work around it as much as possible. Disclaimer, there are certain injuries, there are certain pain that we shouldn't just push through, and hopefully that's the resource that Brad and I can be to you coaches, to our athletes, to kind of delineate that and find the difference. But when I'm working with somebody, how to keep them squatting with pain, these are kind of the factors that I'm thinking of what can I modify to change this movement to let them do it, with more comfort. So is it limiting range of motion? Is it limiting the speed of the movement? So our tissues respond very differently to how fast they're loaded. For either direction can sometimes help. And thinking about mechanics. So is it a knee-based movement? Is it a hip-based movement? If someone has knee pain, let's shift them, just with their setup or where the load is, to shift some of that load to the hip, and maybe that's enough to take that provocative stress off the knee. We can obviously lighten the load. If someone's having pain with a bilateral movement, we can try to change it to a single leg unilateral movement. And something I really like to do is using isometrics. So whether that's a wall sit hold, just to kind of prep my knees, prep my tendons before a heavier load in the squat, or we'll go through a couple examples of specific like positional isometrics we can use that don't involve big changes in range of motion that can be stressful on tissue. Another big one, we'll touch on this at the very end, but sometimes you could change all of those first categories and not have a whole lot of success if we're either overtraining or undertraining. So we need to understand this like holistic load that's on a person that may be contributing to pain or injury. So if we're going to CrossFit 6 days a week, only 2 days a week, and going on 2 hikes on the weekend, that's probably too much. Like, if you're not in pain, you're a freak of nature, and I don't know how that would happen. So just simply like shifting around some training strategy to give our body time to recover, or if we're underloading things, maybe give it a little more of a nudge to bring that capacity up. So that needs to be part of the conversation as well, to continue any of these movements. So again, just a couple examples. Back pain with the barbell squat. If this position is too much load on my hip and back, let's prop the heels, give them a dumbbell. My back has much less kind of shearing anterior load. I'm still getting great load to my legs, and I can stay in the gyms and keep working out. Anterior knee pain, again, let's shift the load from the knees to the hips, go towards just a deadlift or an RDL, something where I'm still putting load through my legs, but it's drastically shifted away. Anterior hip pain, again, I can take away that big hip flexion position. Let's turn it to a goblet squat, make it more knee-based, or even go single leg that gives that kind of hip and pelvis more degrees of freedom to work around the painful positions.
So you mean in your bullet point where you say the lumbar spine flexes 50-80%, does that mean when you're coming down, you're losing the natural lumbar curve when you come down? Like when a butt wink happens, it would kind of lose the arch. Is that what you mean by flexion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's where you have like the energy weak, right? Is that you're losing that stacked position. That's what you mean, correct?
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that the 50 to 80% is just to say, even if you maintain, what we see visually is like stacked, neutral, good position, there is still flexion happening.
Okay.
So that natural kind of extended lumbar lordotic curve, whether or not I can see it, is gonna flex a little bit.
Okay.
And I just mentioned that to say that we don't need to demonize the flexion because it happens, but it should be controlled and hopefully minimized just from a performance standpoint. And how do we do that? Improving hip mobility. So when the hip stops moving, the back starts moving. So if we give you more mobility at the hips, we can take some of that need for motion away, and just strength, right? If we have a strong lumbar extension, then we can hold that position a little bit better as the load gets heavier and as that kind of flexion moment happens. Any other questions on that? Valgus knee cave, the worst thing that has ever happened to a knee. I think this is probably the most recognized fault that we see in squats. So we'll talk about why it might be bad, why it might be good, and why it might kind of be okay. So bad for patellofemoral pain, so pain between the kneecap and the femur. When my knee moves in, the compression forces go way up. So if I have a knee that's painful, that's a real easy way to make it more painful. If I have a knee that's not painful, it might not matter. Maybe my patellofemoral joint can handle that compression, it's okay. But if we have patellofemoral issues, that's a great way to make them worse. I think it restricts hip flexion range. So when we're looking at that picture, the further my knee comes forward, unless I just have great hip mobility, I'm gonna hit a block at some point. If I can keep my knee out further, it just flexes easier, I can get into better positions. So if I'm letting my knees fall in, I'm just stealing away mobility from my hips as I get further into that squat. From kind of a biomechanical perspective, as my knee goes in, I compress the outside of the joint, and then I gap or kind of stretch the inside of the joint. So again, if I have a sensitive lateral compartment, my knee goes in, I'm compressing it, I'm just gonna kind of irritate it more. If I have an irritated MCL or medial meniscus or medial joint capsule that I'm stretching when my knee comes in, again, I'm just putting stress on something that probably doesn't need more stress. And then finally, an energy leak, right? It's just, that's not a strong position to be in. Why might it be good? And I'll show you a couple videos where I think if you pause it, it's gonna look like a knee cave, but if you watch it at full speed, we'll see it as just kind of activation of our adductors to help us out of the bottom of the squat. So we'll look at these. Okay, so she's cleaning 135 kilos. Lightweight.
Not a big deal.
Okay, so that's a perfect front squat, right? Torso's upright,
Yep.
great front rack, knees are out, great range of motion at the ankles. Holding that good knee position, pushing out. But as we're coming out of the hole, too fast. The knees want to dive in, right? So we know this person is insanely strong. There is no weakness in her glutes at all, but she still has her knees kind of inside or towards midline. I'm not worried about that at all. That just tells me her adductors, especially her adductor magnus, is kicking on really strong to help her get up out of the hole. And then as you can see, it straightens back out as things kind of catch up. So from the bottom position of our squat, the adductor magnus can be up to 50% of the moment to get us out of that initial position. So it's really common to see that little, called an adductor whip, or vagus whip, out of the bottom of the squat. Totally okay with that. It's probably advantageous to have.
Stop yelling.
We'll see what he says when he looks at you.
When you get up on the box and stuff.
Squat. Casual 562. Good for
A little useless information. This is my favorite lifter.
He's like the best lifter in the world.
Yeah, he's my favorite.
He's so strong.
So again, perfect position, also perfect anatomy, right? He's got a super long torso, super short legs, great dorsiflexion range of motion.
Beautiful
Like
face.
I could train for my entire life. I will never look like that. You know, with all the steroids and whatever, or lifts in my heels, not gonna happen.
Very attractive.
But again, as we're coming up out of the squat,
Everyone on YouTube will know.
boom, knees come in again. If we freeze frame it there, it's very different than, you know, half a second before. And again, he's just crazy strong, using the muscles that have the best advantage out of that position before we kind of straighten back out to that really stacked knee position. To see that. When we don't want to see it would be on the descent of a squat, right? We don't want to see this caving and call that adductor strength going down. It's not the same thing. That's not a good position for my adductors anyways. So that would definitely be something to cue someone out of. But if we see that little whip at the bottom, I'm okay with it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
You might go over this. So two things. One, is it more of an issue if one leg caves in more than the other? And two, like if someone like dives on the right and not so much on the left on the way up? And then two, if it is completely outside of their control. So when someone goes down for me and they're coming back up and they can press out of it, like they can move their knees back out to do the adductor
Yeah.
engagement, excellent. What about when they really can't and they get stuck here the whole way up? Because then I usually tell people, try not to go below parallel, but hit parallel so we can start strengthening the glutes or do clamshells and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And that comes back to, like, that's probably an energy leak, right? That's just not an efficient position to be in.
Did you hear that?
Video proof, we're gonna water.
So here's, and we'll reinforce this on this slide. If it is uncontrolled, present on the descent, results in pain, makes you severely ill to watch it, or is an energy leak, those are probably things we want to address, right? If it's controlled, present on the initial drive out of the bottom, not painful, aids performance, doesn't make you ill, we're probably okay with it. Good with that?
We're at a 50-50 response rate right now, so we're doing good.
No comment.
No comment. Look at my adductors, Jamie.
Okay, next one, knees over toes. I think most people have kind of put this one to bed at this point, but originally we did some research that showed knees tracking over toes increase the compressive force at the knee. So coaches and especially physical therapists really ran off the trail with that. and said, never let your knees go past your toes. Your knees gonna explode. It's terrible. Well, we found out that if you do restrict the knee motion, again, the load doesn't go away, it just goes somewhere else. And it massively increases the load at my hips and my low back, which on the next slide will show you the relative change to it. But now, so we have that information, so we're gonna swing all the way over to the other side. And thanks to Knees Over Toes guy and some other personalities online, think this is the only way to heal your knees, right? You better get your knee 2 feet past your toe. That fixes every knee problem ever happened, and that's just not the case either. I have to like back him up a little bit. His program is like pretty progressive and starts you doing really simple things, but his persona does not convey that, and I think it leads to a lot of misguided
People are
loading.
trying to do that.
Yeah. You know, if I have for me, I have a torn meniscus. If I go into that much flexion, like it pinches and feels terrible. If someone has patellofemoral pain, that's not gonna feel good. If someone has quad tendon pain, patellotendon pain, it's not gonna feel good, especially going right into that without any context. So we'll talk about some kind of weak links and sticking points, and then get into actually moving and kind of feeling some of these positions as soon as we can. So for the front squat specifically, what I experience, what I see is like a poor front rack, whether it's a setup or maintaining that position through the full movement. So that's dropping the elbows, not being able to get a full grip, which has a lot more context if we're trying to do a jerk afterwards, or just like a full loss of core stability, trunk collapse. Poor drive out of the bottom, which can be influenced by a poor front rack and poor trunk position, but resulting in us getting buried, getting us tipped forward, our hips shooting up, turning it into a good morning instead of a squat. Excessive, uncontrolled knee valgus that may only happen on one side and not get back to the appropriate position. Lateral shifting, if we favor one side more than the other, which kind of goes hand in hand with the strength asymmetry, whether that's one leg to the other, whether that's legs to low back. Just kind of a mismatch in sharing that strength work. This is the self-assessment that will get sent out to everybody, but I think it's that 9 movements or positions. It kind of goes, again, working from the ground up to see, do we have kind of the basic requirements to get into the positions of an optimal front squat. So ankle dorsiflexion, what we'll call ankle lateral tilt. So that second picture, can I keep my foot flat and move my shin far enough to use my hip rotation without that foot coming off the ground. Hip and knee flexion, so can I get my thigh to touch my stomach with my calf on the back of my thigh without any pinching on the front of my hip. Hip rotation, so external rotation, internal rotation, do I kind of have the base abilities there. The big one, and you can see, for me, I don't, especially on, this picture was taken in a mirror, so that's actually my left arm that has limited external rotation compared to my right arm, which makes it tough for me to get in a good front rack. But what we want to see is, when my elbows are lined up with my shoulder, can I get my hand and wrist outside of basically my frame, outside of my shoulder. Thoracic rotation extension, wrist extension, shoulder flexion with a flat back or trunk integrity, trunk stability, and then combined shoulder flexion and elbow flexion. Again, can I basically touch my hand to the top of my shoulder in that front rack position. Okay, corrective exercises. Physical therapists love them, right? We love to give people tons of correctives. I feel like there's a time and place, but again, context is king. The best way to get better at squatting is squatting. And so I think we give people too many sometimes, and I'm just as guilty as anybody. If we have somebody doing correctives for 40 minutes and then squatting for 5, like what are they gonna get better at? So it's having a purpose for each corrective that we give and being able to directly apply it to the position or movement that we're trying to improve. And then there's the whole idea of what's perfect movement, what's correct movement, and that's kind of a can of worms we can get into on another day. Again, there needs to be a why behind each corrective that we give people. And then this is kind of like open-ended, but what's the best way to go about that, right? Do we just break down the complex movement into its parts and work on each part? Do we give people internal cues of squeeze your glute, tighten your ab, raise your shoulder, or external cues of, don't let your knee come away from the box, or like doing squats at the wall where I have to move in response to my environment, or an external cue. And again, it's all going to depend on the person and what we're trying to address. So along those lines, so a good example is that valgus, right? We have poor hip control, we have weak glutes, we have glute amnesia, they're not firing. Something's going on that's letting that knee drop towards midline in the squat. So we give people clamshells or monster walks. Is just giving those drills to somebody going to improve their squat? No. We've shown this in like squatting, we've shown this in running, we've shown this in jumping, that just improving somebody's strength or control in a really isolated task does not transfer to a complex movement or pattern. So those drills are great to just complete the simple task, give them the mind-muscle connection, give people kind of the hardware. Can this joint, can this muscle do what we need to do? But then it needs to be directly applied to what we're trying, the meta complex motion that we're trying to improve. I think this is like just a quick anatomy review for especially the first set that we're going to go through. When we're talking about front rack position, we love to do lat stretching, right? Because the lat's what restricts me here. The thing that I see people missing the most is we don't remember that the lat attaches to our pelvis. So we love to do this and crank the shoulders up and crank my arm back to stretch my lat. But if I'm not controlling my pelvis and keeping it posteriorly tilted, I'm not stretching it. I'm just pulling myself out of position. So anytime we give somebody a lat drill, they better have rib cage down, glute squeeze, maintaining that stacked position that we want them to be in a squat. Not flaring the ribs and losing that kind of core integrity. Okay, let's take benches and kind of go ahead and relax here, and now go up and over again. Okay, it looks great. We have great mobility. If we're not paying attention to what's happening here, we're defeating the purpose of doing this. So cueing somebody to bring the ribs down, squeeze the glutes, have an engaged core is just good practice, and it actually accomplishes what we want. This tips back automatically, so that can just help people get to that position easier. What I really like to do is go ahead and bring your knees up in kind of a tabletop, so lift your feet. Yep, both feet. And then find that contraction. Keep staying flat here, and now raise your arms up and over. Awesome. Flip your hands over so your palms up, and really keep your elbows straight. As I go palms up, I'm externally rotating my shoulder. My lats are internal rotators, so that's again gonna put a little more stretch on it. And now go ahead and try to go up and over. That's pretty, oh, lost your back though. There you go. So this would kind of be the final progression of what's the most challenging position for my lats to work on this mobility. Hips back to our heels and lower our chest and torso below our elbows. And commonly what we'll see is, a lot of flexion and, extension and losing this. I would rather you raise up a little bit and squeeze your glutes, squeeze your abs, and find that active position again, And tell me what happens here.
It stretches?
It stretches. Get to that prayer stretch position. First, let yourself kind of fall into it, not having the active core, and then see what feeling changes when you bring your ribs down, squeeze your glutes. And for some people, it might not change a lot. I mean, a lot of people have good shoulder mobility, so even when they engage their lats, they have plenty of room.
Yeah, there you go.
Honestly, I see that being more limiting than lats for a lot of people. As you get to the bottom of a squat, lats come into play more, but just that base front rack position, if I can't rotate my shoulder enough, it's really tough to get into an efficient spot. The other thing that rotating my shoulder more does is it functionally shortens my forearm. So if we think of like, if you're looking straight on, this is the entire length of my forearm that I kind of have to deal with pushing them back into the bar. If I rotate it out, I kind of turn into a triangle, right? If we go back to trig, that's going to shorten that a little bit, right? So just in doing that, I don't have as long of a lever that I'm dealing with from a kind of upper body perspective if I get that arm out. And it'll make more sense when we actually get into a front rack. Cam is cheating a little bit.
Oh, he's cheating.
Am I right now?
Now, there you go.
Oh,
There you
still
go.
is
Still really
lost.
mobile. And so do this on both sides.
I'll watch this.
Am I cheating?
Yep. So you want the elbows right in front of the shoulder.
90 degrees.
Yep. And so holding a PVC, I want on the outside of my forearm. I'll sneak my hand around, elbows directly in front of the shoulder, using my other hand just to lever this into external rotation. Something to think about here is let's try to keep our whole hand on the PVC. So we're stretching more shoulder and less wrist. Wrist will come later. What I want you to think about with this is a light, long stretch. If I'm cranking so hard that I can hold it for 10 seconds, but our body needs longer loading, longer stretches to make tissue level changes that are gonna last down the road. So just keep that in mind. You're not trying to dislocate your shoulder. You shouldn't be in pain while doing this. Go to a light, productive stretch that you can hang out for a minute plus. I'm gonna set up a band. So again, I can start in that position we're kind of assessing from. I want to be far enough out that I have some tension that's pulling me into external rotation. And then I'm going to use my internal rotators to bring it in and then slowly control it out. So again, I'm controlling it with the muscles that are kind of restricting this motion, as well as activating this muscle in a stretch position so my nervous system knows it's okay to be here, and getting a little bit of rotator cuff strength while I do. The other hand is a platform, just to make sure I'm disciplined with where my elbow's going.
Day,
And so the focus here is the
Okay.
control that's pulling my hand out. It's not as much on kind of turning my hand in. I want to be controlling that out and really try to squeeze to get a little bit further, letting the band help me. I'm going to talk a little bit about thoracic extension. So again, fighting that tendency to kind of get pulled down into flexion when we load it. A really easy way to do it is just to raise my arms over my head. Like as we saw, our back wants to extend. So we're going to be attentive to not letting our low back extend and focusing on extending through our rib cage, through our upper back. And a really easy way to do that is just facing the wall. So I've Brad face the wall, kind of go elbows towards it. I want a little bend in his knees. And I want the glutes a little squeeze and the abs pulled down so we have a nice set at his core. So watch his upper back as he just slides his hands up. Actually stand a little closer to the wall. Okay, now back up a little bit.
And now we cha-cha.
Okay, so we can see we have this normal thoracic kyphotic, a little bit rounded curve. Everybody has it. As he raises, I just want to see this flatten out just a little bit. It's really subtle, but I promise you it's happening, and that's just going to encourage us to extend here and not here. So it seems like kind of a really easy, pointless drill, but again, it's that control of where am I extending through my back to keep a stacked, strong torso. So let's spread out, find an open spot of wall, and just work on those slides.
In your middle.
You could feel your lats because you're kind of fighting your lats here.
I say I kind of feel like we're extension.
Assume that we're working on a position where we're going to go to a jerk out of it. So we're not going to go fingertip grip that we might go to if we're just front squatting. I don't think it's bad to go fingertip grip if I want to challenge my legs and load my front squat higher, and if I can get into a better, more stacked front rack, that's okay. But if we're working towards improving our early lifting and we just want to improve overall mobility, let's try to go with a more full-handed grip where we're not letting go into the fingertips. In full disclosure on this, I stole this drill from Quinn Hannock, who I'd recommend you guys follow. He's a PT online with Clinical Athlete and Juggernaut. But they made the point that a lot of times when we get set up to a front rack, we kind of get here and then try to jam our elbows up as high as we can. Instead of starting almost below with my elbows in a good position and then raising up into it. So instead of starting here and driving forward, I'm gonna start a little bit lower with my elbows up and then push up, maintaining that elbow position. And my elbows aren't great, like I don't have a great front rack, you guys are gonna way better. But think of that I'm gonna start with a good full hand grip, push my elbows to where I want them to be, and then see if I can raise kind of my collarbones and chest out to the bar and maintain my elbows as high as I can. Maybe bar at about eye.
Yep.
Yeah, because I think that people like where if I start below, then I'm good. And I can kind of slack. But again, we're gonna have to coach.
That's why I always.
Position. He might have the tendency to want to drift his hips forward and then stand up. This is an exaggeration. Right? But what we want to do is stay stacked, so drop down a little bit. Stay in a good stacked position and raise straight up to address the bar, not scoop my hips under and trick myself into thinking I have more extension than I do. The last bullet points here are more for kind of loaded progressions of this. So some kettlebell front rack, just carries. I know you guys work that into your core as it is. Those are great ways to kind of reinforce this mobility we're working on under load, right? And under a little bit lighter load than we'll be with the front squat, but still maintaining that integrity of that whole position. So just some ideas there. What I want to get to though is talking about some drills to improve driving out of the hole. There's a couple different things we can address to help with that. So I kind of put them in three categories. So one is just going to be modified squat drills, where we're really working on kind of the skill and the pattern of executing things in the right order to get out of the hole. The second thing, the second group of bullet points, is just isolated targeted quad strength. When we get down to the bottom of a squat, we're going to go through the path of least resistance or whatever our body is strongest at. So if my brain doesn't think that my quads are strong enough to push out, I'm going to get rid of my quads early and make my back and my hips pull it up. So I can address that in a couple ways, right? I can just, from a technique perspective, drive my knees forward, keep my chest up, and work on that, right? But if I don't have the horsepower from my legs, all the technique in the world isn't gonna help me do that. So just some drills and some lifts that make the quad work harder So doing like roller hack squats against the wall, doing single leg, very quad biased squats, or even popping the heels up, shifting my knees forward, and doing very biased goblet squats. And I think it kind of has to be both and, not either or. So let's go. Adding some like explosive power type training. So that's something Ken and I have worked on. He was having issues feeling like powerful coming out of the bottom of squats. So we did some single leg, like powerful extensions from that deep hip flex position, which we don't do a ton of in CrossFit beyond like targeted Olympic weightlifting. So first, let's go. Actually, let's have Cannon come up. What's gonna do? And a really good way to help people feel staying in the legs is just giving them the cue of keep your knee in contact with my hand as long as you can as you drive up. So, yep. And now go ahead and come back down. Now get your knee away from my hand as fast as you can. You did it too good. So go ahead and come back down. Drive your hips up first. So the knee comes away from my hand immediately if the hips go first. Go ahead and come back down. If he keeps it in contact, he comes much more straight up. And I think it's hard. It's hard for me, and it's hard for people to, think about tuck my hips under, keep my back up. But if I have a cue of my knee needs to stay in contact or pushing forward, it's a lot easier to stay in my legs and use them as I come back up. Let's everybody grab. Just gonna do a goblet squat. Your partner is gonna give you the feedback of contact with their hand as you come up out of the hole. So I want you to do it intentionally the wrong way first, where your hips rise and your knee pops back, just to feel that motion. And then the next couple reps, you're gonna push up, keeping that knee in contact, and even exaggerate as long as you can. You might feel kind of goofy, but I guarantee that's gonna keep your trunk more upright and make you use your quads and legs more.
So hips first.
Nice.
Hips first. Yep. Wrong. Yeah, no, back down.
Was it wrong?
Yeah, no. No, that was good, but that's like the wrong way. Now keep your knee against my hand and come up. Yeah, good.
You to the 20.
You got this.
Both our knees pop. But I'm not squatting.
Yeah?
What does that feel like?
It feels fine on my back, but like my is just
That's okay. That's okay.
That's fine.
This is just going to be a rig supported squat where this can be, mobility, this can be motor control, trunk position. We're kind of checking a lot of boxes here. So I'm going to come down to the bottom of a squat, and I have the support of the rig to kind of counterbalance me, or else I would fall backwards because my mobility is not great. But I can use this to keep my torso really upright. And from here I can work on driving my knees out, tucking my hips underneath, trying to get my mid-backs tight, everything we worked on up to this point. My core is engaged, and I'm just like owning this position. I'm getting great dorsiflexion of my ankles, and I'm just contracting muscles in the position that I want them to be able to under load in a squat. And I can kind of come out of it, I can rock back into it, really working on that upright torso, squeezing my mid-back. I can work my hands up here if I want to work towards that overhead position or front rack position while I'm kind of exploring where I feel limitations or tightness for my hips, ankles, knees, low back. Keep my hips tucked underneath. I don't have to stick my hips out just to stay balanced. I have that in front of me so I can work on great technique in a more controlled situation. People can give that to people and say, can you achieve these kind of standards? And they're like, oh no, I can't lift my hand off the post, or I can't keep my low back flat when I go overhead. Then that is the direction, right? Kind of the lowest hanging fruit of where they're limited. And it is like so person to person dependent. but that's kind of the best way that I can think of, is these like really gross standards of if you can't meet these, then we don't need to get to the nitty gritty because there's a pretty big issue we can address here. You know, they're tipping forward at the bottom of maybe a snatch or even catching a clean. You know, it could be they don't have enough dorsiflexion. It could be they don't have enough hip flexion. It could be they can't get their elbow into a front rack so they get caved. It could be they're not strong enough to hold a proper torso. But if, you know, every time we see somebody miss at the bottom and we just say, oh, it's ankles, you know, it's dorsiflexion, or oh, it's lats, we're gonna chase things that don't need to be chased. So having at least some structure to go off of, and let them do it on their own and kind of find what they're struggling with. That just tying it to one aspect of the movement doesn't always work, and it's different for everybody. So, you know, if those few adjustments don't work, like, it's just frustrating and probably not worth anybody's time. That's what Brad and I are here for, to dig deeper into that stuff. So